Hello, class. Welcome to part one of Buddhism. I just want to start by kind of tying Buddhism into Hinduism. We're going to talk about this throughout these lectures on Buddhism, but it's important to note at the outset here that Buddhism is a tradition that develops out of Hinduism. We'll come to learn that Siddhartha Gautama, the quote-unquote founder of Buddhism, was a Hindu himself. So the reason that's important to know right here in the beginning is that we're going to see a lot of similarities between Hinduism and Buddhism. For example, there will be very similar notions of suffering, very similar notions of reincarnation, very similar notions of release from suffering, or what we learned was moksha in Hinduism will become somewhat like nirvana in Buddhism, this release from the wheel of samsara, the wheel of reincarnation. So while we'll see a lot of these similarities, we're also going to be wanting to pay close attention to the differences, because as these traditions develop historically, we see them diverge in really significant ways. So it's important that we constantly pay attention to how Buddhism differs from Hinduism. Why does it develop as a new tradition? What are these major issues that the Buddha himself and his early followers are grappling with, in which they reject in the tradition of Hinduism? So we'll pay close attention to that. Before we get into the details, I want to kind of talk about this general question that I often get. Is Buddhism a religion or is it a philosophy? And I understand, I think, where this question's coming from, or why people so often ask this question or assert their answer to this question so confidently. I think it might be because most forms of Buddhism, or many of the forms of traditional Buddhism that we'll be discussing in this course, don't incorporate any gods. There's no God, there's no prayer, there's no worship of this kind of classical religious sense. So many people interpret this to mean that Buddhism is less of a religion and more of a philosophical perspective or orientation to the world. However, at the same time, Buddhism does incorporate many of the classic criteria that we've used to define religion. So there's a code of ethics, there's some of the essential questions are being asked, there's scripture, there's a founder, many rituals develop, holidays, so on and so forth. So I guess my point and my job here is not to answer this question, is not to say, is it a philosophy? Yes. Or is it a religion? Yes or no. But rather to raise awareness to why we might be asking these questions. And wherever you fall on this debate might say more about your understanding of religion or how you define religion than it does about the tradition itself. So this is something I always want you to grapple with. Why do we categorize certain traditions as religious, others as philosophical orientations? But the goal is not to have a clear, clean delineation between the two, but to always be aware that we are making these categorizations all the time. So is Buddhism just a set of beliefs? We'll see that there are certain prominent beliefs that arise, that come to the fore in Buddhism. However, it goes beyond a set of beliefs. We get a real push toward experience. So the Buddha, we'll see, teaches many times throughout his life, I can't teach you, I can't give you a creed, I can't give you a set of rules or morals. You need to discover these on your own. So there's a push to experience the world, experience suffering and release from suffering, rather than just listen to someone's teachings and follow them directly. Actually, throughout his life, he says, do not do what I do. Find your own path. Be a light unto yourself. It is very much an orientation to the world. Like I'm saying, it's very experiential. To be a Buddhist, you don't just memorize a set of beliefs. You must learn often to meditate. You must question the nature of suffering. You must question your own ethical and moral effect in the world. Are you creating a better, more profitable world? Are you being compassionate? Or are you contributing to increased suffering around the world? And then Buddhism is very focused on the notion of suffering. And this comes out of Hinduism. I hope you kind of have grasped this from our section on Hinduism. The problem is that we suffer. To live is to suffer. To live is to experience loss. It is to experience sadness. It is to be attached to certain things, only to see that those attachments are false in a way, that they are not permanent, that they will be lost over time. So Buddhism is trying to demonstrate that this suffering comes from the self. As in Hinduism, we talked about Atman, the self is not fully realized, is not pure in our everyday realization of it. So rather, we must understand what the true self is, and that true self can be detached, and detachment means less suffering. So what we'll see is a variety of practices that arise in Buddhism, like Hinduism, that seek to divest the self of its attachments, to ease our suffering in this way. However, and we'll go over this in more detail, the Buddhist answer is not the renunciation, the extreme resistance to attachment, but rather to find a moderate middle path between indulgence and renunciation. That there's a happy medium between the two. We don't need to give up everything, but we should always question the attachments that we have formed. So, your book actually discusses this parable of the wounded man. Sometimes it's translated as the parable of the inflicted man, that I really enjoy. I think it wraps up some of the core concepts in Buddhism quite well. And it says, imagine this man who's been shot with a poisoned arrow. Now, this man is supposed to be indicative of every one of us. We all go through this experience. We all suffer. So this this poisoned arrow that has wounded this man, that represents all forms of suffering. So this man is wounded, he's feeling pain, and this poison is slowly seeping into his body, slowly killing him. Now the Buddha says, of course, we all suffer, we're all experiencing this predicament to some degree. Now, should we ask, who shot us? Who shot me? Why? Why did that person shoot me? Where did that person come from? What will happen after I die? No. The Buddha says these are silly, silly questions. We should not be concerned with the classical existential questions that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and other traditions are very much concerned with. These, great questions about the world and our existence, our place in that world. The Buddha says, no, we're suffering. We have an arrow that is leaking poison into our body. What should we do? Should we spend time asking these questions? No, remove the arrow. Find the source of the suffering, in this case, the arrow. Pull it out. Release yourself from the suffering. It doesn't help to know where it came from. It doesn't help to know why it's happening, what's going to happen after you die. These questions are such less concern for someone who is actually being poisoned at the time. So the Buddha says, remove the arrow. And Buddhism becomes a tradition that teaches you how to remove the metaphorical arrow, how to release yourself from suffering. So, I've already talked about this figure. We'll continue to talk about him throughout these lectures. The Buddha himself is Siddhartha Gautama, a human being who became enlightened, or what the word Buddha means, awakened. So the Buddha means the awakened one. And the Buddha teaches after he becomes enlightened or awakened that we can all become awakened. He's not special in this regard. I have later on, he's not a god, he's not a deity, he's not a prophet. He, like all of us, is a human being, someone who experiences suffering, someone who tried very hard to release himself from the suffering through many Hindu paths, because he was a Hindu. And he comes to find that he found his own path, a somewhat controversial path at the time, but that it's so much deeper and truer and purer than what he was taught in his Hindu tradition. So he goes and spends the remainder of his life telling everyone that there is release from suffering and you must find your own path. Now, today there are about 400 to 500 million Buddhists, so a substantial religious tradition, not as large as Hinduism, about half the size of Hinduism actually, not as large as Islam, not as large as Christianity, but it does come in as the fourth largest religion in the world, so one that we must spend some time talking about here in this lecture. Now, who is Siddhartha Gautama, who we know now as the Buddha? He's a man who was born and raised in the area of India, northeastern India, that is today Nepal. Now, he was born in 563 BCE, so this tradition starts about 600 years before Christianity. And he's born in a very wealthy, privileged family. His father is a king, his mother is a queen, so he is a prince himself. And he's a very wealthy, privileged prince. Like I said, he is Hindu, and because he is born as a prince in this traditional Hindu wealthy family, he is part of the Kshatriya caste. Now, if you remember back during Hinduism, the Kshatriya are the kings and the warriors, right? Not the high priests, not the ones who are supposed to endeavor in religious affairs or study texts. No, their duty is prescribed by their caste, by their social position. And being a Kshatriya, being a prince, his duty is to, like his father and mother, to rule, to be a leader of the people, a politician in some ways, but more of a kind of wealthy ruler in his own right. Part of his duty is also to marry, to have children, and to continue the legacy of his father and generations prior. So this is his duty. However, we'll come to learn he does not do his duty. He is not content with living this life that has been set for him by his dharma or his Hindu duty. When he was born, there were these early predictions for Siddhartha. These noblemen or seers of some way came to him and came to his parents once Siddhartha was born, and they say, he's going to be this great conqueror of the world. Now that word to conquer it was a bit ambiguous. It left a lot of options open. So mother and father weren't quite sure what this could mean. Would it mean, as they hoped, that he would conquer the physical world as a king should do to keep his power over his territory and over his people? This is what his parents wanted for him, and more importantly, this was his duty. This is the caste duty that was prescribed to him. Or could to conquer the world mean the non-physical world, the spiritual world? Would he conquer the mind? Would he conquer the self in this sense? We'll come to learn that this is the path that Siddhartha Gautama does take, more the right or the duty of the Brahmins, right? Of the Brahmin, I-N, caste, but that to understand Brahman, the totality of all existence, ultimate reality. Now, of course, his father wants him to do the one thing. His duty, his Kshatriya duty, is to do the one thing. Siddhartha Gautama, however, does not do that one thing. He becomes, early in his life, pretty disillusioned with the facade that is presented to him. So his father actually creates this world for Siddhartha, this palace that he lives in, that Siddhartha is not allowed to leave. He's given everything he could ever want within the palace walls. He's given as much food, as much shelter, as much luxurious items. He has women, he has friends, he has his cousin who he's very close with, and that he never experiences suffering. So this is supposed to be representative of each and every one of us. We live in our bubbles. We kind of shy away from suffering. I can't speak for everyone who's taking this course, but we can all, I suppose, relate to this idea of having what we need and ignoring to some extent suffering, not having suffering penetrate into our lives. Now, many of us have lost loved ones, have suffered from poverty, or some of us have been abused. We experience suffering, to be sure, and we don't want to ignore that. But much of our lives is to ignore the suffering and to try to kind of remain within our bubble. So this palace walls that Siddhartha Gautama is supposed to be representative of that. He's kind of the extreme example of this bubble that we all try to create for ourselves. He's given everything and experiences no suffering. So he decides when he's in his 20s, early 20s, to leave the palace walls. He says, no, this isn't real. What I'm being presented here doesn't seem right. There's a whole world out there that I haven't experienced. And Siddhartha asks these deeper questions. So he leaves the palace walls and he goes to experience the world itself. And when he does leave the palace walls, he sees what we now call the four signs. The first one is he sees an old man who is aging. He's just an old man. Siddhartha's never been exposed to an old person because within the palace walls, he's kept in this kind of privileged and rather ignorant life. So he goes out and he's with his friend and he says, "What is wrong with that person? He's hunched over and his skin is wrinkly and he looks like he's hurting and something's wrong with him." And his friend says, "He's just old, Siddhartha. That happens to all of us. That's best case scenario, right? If you're not old, that means you died young. So best case scenario is you end up like him at the end of your life." And Siddhartha goes, "Oh shit, I didn't know this and that sounds awful and I don't want to become that." So they move on and they keep experiencing the world outside of the palace walls. And he comes across a man who is sick, ill with disease. And he says to his friend, ignorant Siddhartha here, "What is wrong with this guy?" And his friend says, "He's sick. He has a disease. Many people suffer from disease and they die young. And in the process, they are in pain. They're suffering because of this." And again, Siddhartha is like, "Oh man, this sounds awful. Everything seems great in the palace walls, but look at everything that's actually happening in the world. This is the real world. And this could happen to me. I am susceptible to this as well." So we see here he is struggling with existence itself. He moves on and he sees a dead person. He sees death. He sees someone being carried to his funeral pyre. And he says, "What's wrong with that man? He's lying still. He's not responding. He seems asleep, but in a different state of sleep." And his friend again says, "That person has died, Siddhartha, after illness. If you get through or escape illness, and once you age, the end for you is death. You will die. You'll cease to exist here on earth." And Siddhartha again is troubled by this and doesn't really know how to handle the reality of life, suffering, and loss. Finally, with all these questions brewing, all of his insecurities present in him, he comes across a sannyasin. Now, a sannyasin, we learned in the Hindu context, is someone like a sadhu, someone who has released himself from suffering. Remember, this is a Hindu world that he's living in. These are Hindu people. And he finds this sannyasin who has found release from suffering. He seems content. He does not seem disturbed by all of the suffering around him, though he is in the world of suffering. He's surrounded by it, though he seems at peace. And Siddhartha Gautama looks at him and says, "I want that. I want release from this. I want to feel content from, or I want my mind and my emotions to be put at ease. I cannot deal with this suffering." So what the Buddha does is he takes on a life of the sannyasin, right? In the Hindu context, to find release from suffering, to become, to experience moksha, is to take on this life of strict renunciation, to give up as much as possible in order to understand the self, in order to detach the self from the world around you. So he does this. The suffering has become way too overwhelming. He's searching for some kind of release, and he does what a Hindu would do at the time. He seeks to become an ascetic or a sannyasin. So he reaches out to these yogi masters, and he begins to study meditation, to become a forest dweller, and then beyond that, to totally and fully release himself from his attachments, to test the limits of the self, to transcend all of his senses, to perfect meditation, to demonstrate complete control, and to no longer have any desires in the world. And it turns out Siddhartha Gautama is really good at this. He is able to perfect meditation quickly. He passed all the yogi masters that are teaching him. He becomes almost a saint in this sense. People look at him and say, "Wow, you are able to do this like no one we have ever met before." And that's what this statue is indicating here to the right. It's called the Starving Buddha. It's showing him during this time of his traditional Hindu form of release, where he gives up everything, even his desire to eat. So he is wasting away till near starvation. The problem at this point is he does not experience release. He does not experience what they call moksha, or full release from this world or the self. He also finds it problematic at the end of this experience of his, because he says, well, even if I did achieve release, if I attained moksha, other people are still suffering in the meantime. So even if I myself can be released from suffering, what about all the people in that village that I just encountered? The ones who are sick, the ones who are old, the ones who are dying. My meditating in the forest isn't helping them. And furthermore, it's bringing suffering, a form of suffering, to himself, right? His body is suffering in this very literal way. It is wasting away. So what does he do? He comes to terms with these two extremes that he's just experienced, right? He experienced extreme luxury on the one hand, total and complete privilege, the life of a wealthy prince who has never experienced suffering whatsoever, and he's just experienced the life of complete asceticism, of complete renunciation. And he says neither one of these orientations addresses the suffering in the world. Neither of them are able to push beyond the suffering in the world, and both of them cause suffering in some way, right? The wealthy, privileged life causes suffering because to have all of these resources, to have all of these goods, means that you're benefiting off of the suffering of, slave labor, of other forms of suffering that you're benefiting from as well. So during this moment of starvation, near starvation, when he's practicing with these Hindu yogis, a young girl, this is how the story is told at least, a young girl approaches him and offers him a bowl of rice, a very simple bowl of rice, plain rice in a small bowl. And she says, here, eat something, you're going to die. And he says, okay. And he does eat, and he feels better. And he realizes he's not fully indulging, eating the, gluttonous menu that the palace had to offer, but he's also not starving himself. There's some moderate place in between these two extremes that one can find clarity of mind, that one can be released from suffering in a different way. At the same time, then, the story goes, he hears a man playing a sitar. A sitar is a stringed instrument, and the man's tuning the guitar, and Siddhartha realizes that when the string is too tight, think of the renunciate here, when you're too strict, it snaps, it breaks, as the renunciate would die in the end. And he says, that's not good. The sitar doesn't sound good. You can't play the sitar when the string snaps. And then he realizes when he's tuning it and it's too loose, when you're not thinking too much in the life of the wealthy prince, that it doesn't make a sound that is pleasing to the ear, that this is not the way this instrument is supposed to play. The way this instrument is supposed to be played is somewhere between these two extremes, where it can make this really beautiful sound and create something like music, something that transcends the normal mundane experiences that we all engage in. So with these various experiences in mind, he does come to this revelation that there is a way between these two extremes, which he calls the middle path. He says we must sustain, or we must eat to sustain our lives, right? We must eat something, and we shouldn't starve ourselves, we shouldn't overindulge, we should be moderate and considerate and compassionate about how we eat. So many people today, for example, are very critical of those who eat way too much, who waste their food, who order types of food that are damaging to the environment or to animals. However, they're also not starving themselves. To eat anything means it had to be produced, there had to be some labor involved. So we must kind of eat ethically. We must find a middle path between these two extremes. This is the reason many Buddhists, and many non-Buddhists as well, choose a vegetarian or vegan diet, right? Eat in a way that causes less suffering to animals and the laborers that create that food. But we must eat to sustain. We have to. We're animals ourselves that must continue to eat. So let's try to find a state of balance between these two extremes. The world functions in a state of balance. We too must strike this balance in our own lives. So with all this in mind, he goes to meditate under what is called the Bodhi tree. And he meditates for 49 straight days. And it's during this meditation, post this understanding of the middle path, that he achieves what he calls nirvana. Now, nirvana means to be blown out or blowing out. The idea is the self that you thought you had, that individual understanding, is blown out and is totally extinguished. There's nothing left within us. So in the state of nirvana, one achieves complete clarity, complete control of our senses, of our mind, and complete insight into the way the world actually functions. What is blown out is the self, like I said, your sense of despair, suffering, attachments, desires. That is all gone, and all that is left is complete clarity and control. So it is during this time that he becomes enlightened. He becomes the Buddha, the awakened one, once he achieves enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. But while he's under the Bodhi tree, he experiences many different temptations. So we can see here in this photo, these are all forms of what we will call Mara. Now, I'm going to talk about that concept in a little more depth here. But Mara comes in many, many forms, and the idea is Mara is not a demon, Mara is not a devil, Mara is not a temptress or a tempter. Rather, Mara is just our inability to control our own desires. So every one of us would be infected with Mara to some degree. We don't have the ability to totally and completely control our own desires. So during meditation, Mara comes at him. Mara is sometimes defined as the personification of death and rebirth, meaning when Mara has control over us, we're still attached to ourself, we're attached to the world, therefore we will be reborn, right? We're going to live, die, and then be reborn. To be reborn is not a good thing. Remember, this is consistent with Hinduism. To be reborn means you're going to be born again into this world and you're going to suffer more. So the goal is to not be reborn. The goal is to extinguish the self. There's nothing left to be reborn into this world so that you can escape suffering. The goal for Buddhism, what is the state of nirvana, is to settle the mind. It is to come to a state where you have control over your thoughts and your thoughts don't have control over you. So Mara in this regard is anything that unsettles the mind. Many of us, all of us I would assume, have experienced that laying awake in bed in the middle of the night, thinking about exams that are coming up, thinking about something that happened in a relationship that we're involved in, thinking about the big game coming up next week. Whatever it might be, we have this inability to quiet those thoughts and to be in the present moment, to realize what you're doing at the time is laying, hopefully, in a comfortable bed, able to rest your body, to rest your mind. If you're not able to do that, that means you're not in control of your own mind. You're not you're still very much attached to these things in the world, these desires, these people, these expectations, these regrets, whatever that might be, you're still very much attached. Now, Mara sometimes looks like a Satan-like figure, as we've seen in this picture in the background. These are Satan-like figures that are depicted. Mara is not Satan. Keep in mind this tradition comes long before Satan. It is not influenced by Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Mara just represents our inherent psychological forces, right? So Siddhartha's resistance, his successful resistance of Mara during this 49 days of meditation, demonstrates that he does have complete control. He's not affected by, he's not drawn in by all of these temptations of the world. So nirvana becomes, I should say, nirvana is impossible to describe, right? It's described as ineffable, meaning impossible to be put into words. One way, though, that we might describe nirvana is in this analogy of a stormy sea versus a tranquil lake. Now, I myself am a backpacker. I backpack up in the high Sierra Nevada mountains quite often, and I fly fish. So I've experienced this many times myself. I also deep sea fish. So if you've ever fished in any of these situations, you'll get what I'm talking about. And even if you haven't, I'm sure you can follow along here. Imagine yourself on a big, huge 30-foot, 40-foot boat out in the middle of the ocean, big waves all around you, and you're trying to fish. And you've got waves crashing over, you've got wind, you've got people on the deck yelling to other people, You've got 40 people out there on this boat, moving in every which direction. And then imagine you drop, you see a little tiny fish just jumps out of the water and back in. You don't see it. It just happens 30 feet from you. Would you be able to register that small fish jumping out and then back down? Probably not, because your mind is not in a state of control or clarity. You're moving around like the stormy sea. You wouldn't be able to hear it. You wouldn't be able to sense it. You wouldn't even know it was there. Now, imagine yourself on a calm, tranquil lake at 11,000 feet up in the mountains. There's no wind. There's no ripples on the water. And you're sitting on a tiny little boat or just on the shore. And you can't hear a single thing, not a bird chirping. You're just out there and it's calm. And you see the same size fish, or maybe you don't see it, but the same size fish jumps out of the water and back in. Would your mind be able to register that? Yes. You'd be able to hear it. You'd be able to look over. You'd be able to see the ripples, the effect of that movement. So being in the state of nirvana is like being on that tranquil lake. Every little thing that's happening, you can register, and that you can make sense of, and that you can have control over. Now you're on that stormy sea, you have no control, you're at the whims of what this sea is doing, you can't take any control over it, and you can't understand what your goal is, you can't grasp your goal because everything is so chaotic. So to become in a state of nirvana is to be in this tranquil state. You're going to see many depictions of the Buddha laying down on his side like this, with a lotus flower of some sort underneath his head. These are depictions of the Buddha's death. So it's said that he suffered from food poisoning at the age of 80 and passed blissfully or peacefully on his side like this. So whenever you see a depiction of like this, this is the Buddha, kind of passing over into an eternal state of nirvana or to an eternal state of nothingness, which we will get to in these next slides here. Just a little recap as well, we talked about his achievement of nirvana was at age 35. So he then taught his path for the next 45 years. That's a long time in which the Buddha was able to explain his message, to teach others, initially his family and his smaller community, but then eventually what we come to call the Sangha, which is the larger community. The Buddha changed quite a lot of things. One of which is the most lasting and which we talk about the most often, is that he really challenged many of the Hindu norms in ways that really are the kind of social differentiating factors of Buddhism when compared to Hinduism. So he challenged many of the traditions, and also he completely rejected the caste system. If you don't remember what the caste system is, I recommend you go back and read that section. But he rejects this notion of caste. He says instead, everyone, quote, must be a lamp unto themselves. So instead of a caste duty, which is the Hindu notion, your duty is your dharma, and that depends on what caste you're born into and what caste you live and grow up into. Instead of your duty being dependent upon that caste, he says, no, the caste duty does not determine one's path for what is right and wrong, or what one ought to do or should be doing. Rather, each person, himself and herself, must determine what is right and what is wrong. There's a new dharma that is replacing this Hindu sense of dharma that is reliant upon caste. So I have kind of a longer quotation here. Bear with me. I'll just read it along with you. He says, don't be misled by reports or tradition or hearsay. Don't be misled by the authority of religious texts, not by mere logic or inference, not by considering appearances, not by the daylight in speculative opinions, not by seeming possibilities, not by the idea, this is our teacher. So here he's really rejecting many of these Hindu traditions of learning through a guru or reading the sacred texts of the Vedas and the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, things like this. He rejects a lot of this and says we have this sense of what is right and wrong within each and every one of us. It becomes muddled and it becomes obscured in many ways, but we don't need to look outside to find that. We need to look into ourselves, and it doesn't matter if what caste you're born into. It doesn't matter where you're placed in the social hierarchy. What matters is that you are able to kind of become in touch with this inner Buddha, or this sense of what is good and what is healthy and what is peaceful, which we'll talk about more in a bit here. To continue the quote right here, when you know for yourselves that certain things are unwholesome and wrong and bad, then give them up. And when you know for yourselves that certain things are wholesome and good, then accept them and follow them. So again, just what I said there, that we have this sense within ourselves of what is wholesome, what is good, and that we ought to follow that. So if we think back about that story in the Bhagavad Gita of Lord Krishna coming down and telling Arjuna, don't do what you think is good and right, to not fight because you're going to see your brothers and your family and your loved ones and your neighbors killing each other. We learn in that story from this Hindu context that one's duty is what one ought to be concerned with. As a Kshatriya, Arjuna is obliged to fight. His duty is to fight. This is his caste role. Therefore, this is his duty, and this is what creates good karma, good action, results from paying respect to and doing the duty of your caste. Buddha is saying something very different here. He's saying, no, don't look to teachers, don't look to what you've been told, don't look to these religious texts. Follow your own sense of what is right and wrong. In essence, Buddhism, when compared to Hinduism, and this is just one kind of minor thing I'll say, is compassion for others and for the world and for oneself replaces this notion of duty. So when one thinks, what ought I do in the Hindu context, and looks to what is his or her duty, based on gender, based on caste, based on stage of life, the Buddha is saying, replace all of that with compassion. Compassion for the world, compassion for the other, and compassion for the self. Here, we're going to talk about three concepts, which are known as the 3 marks of existence. And then I'm going to wrap up this lecture. It's going to be a short one, like I said, and we'll get into a couple other concepts next week. But I just want to concentrate on these 3 to make sure we can all wrap our head around each one of these concepts: anicca, dukkha, and anatta. First one we'll look at is anicca. I think your book has it written in this parenthetical form I have here, anicca with a T-Y-A instead of the 2 C's. You're going to get variations of spelling. You notice it in Hinduism, I'm sure. You'll get the same in Buddhism. Some of this will be written in Sanskrit. Some of it will be written in Pali, P-A-L-I, another local language of the time. So it's going to be perhaps confusing. I try to pair these words when there are multiple spellings that you're coming across. So bear with me there. There are not too many of them. Anicca is the first mark of existence. And this is the notion of impermanence. So when I say 3 marks of existence, what we're talking about here is, what is reality? What exists in its natural form? What is the world made up of? How do we exist in this world? What is real? There are these 3 kind of main notions that the Buddha and then Buddhism as a tradition focus on as foundational to much of what develops in the philosophy of Buddhism, but also in the lifestyle and in the traditions that emerge from there. So this first one, anicca, is the notion of impermanence. So nothing is permanent. Everything in the world, when it comes to the flowers you see, to yourself, to the rivers and the roads, and everything is impermanent. It's always changing. Life itself will end. It is not permanent. However, the Buddha realizes, and this is very much in line with the Hindu context, that we're prone to attachments. As human beings, we like to attach ourselves to things. Emotionally, intellectually, physically, we like to attach ourselves to things. We attach ourselves to our own existence. We delude ourselves into thinking that we exist now, and even though we know we'll die, we tend to kind of ignore it and think less about it. and instead think that will always exist, and if it's not here, it's in some other realm. We're also prone to attaching ourselves to our possessions, our relationships, our lovers, our children, our parents, our friends. We tend to think of these things as always existing. We'll forever be lovers. We'll forever be friends. This, however, is not the case. The Buddha makes the very, I think, basic observation that this is an illusion of permanence. That this notion that there's any permanence in the world is completely illusory. It's fake. We tend to just create this in our minds because it's comforting in many ways, right? So in reality, he says everything's in constant flux. Nothing remains constant except change. The only constant is that everything is always changing. And then the Buddha says, the suffering that is so present in the world, this suffering arises as a result of these illusory attachments, which are assumed to be permanent. So the idea here is, because nothing is permanent, everything is impermanent, but we delude ourselves, we have these illusions that there is permanence, this disjunction here causes suffering, because we're attaching ourselves to something that is going to end, that is going to become impermanent in a very obvious way. So, because of this, we will suffer, which brings us to the second mark of existence, which is dukkha. So dukkha just means suffering. Not suffering necessarily in the sense of I'm in pain, I'm ill, I'm dying as we speak, but kind of a more inclusive sense of suffering, which is just this general absence of joy, this general absence of ease, and this constant desire for more, that we're never fulfilled in this fullest sense. To live is to suffer. And anything outside of this sense of suffering is fleeting, and it's disingenuous, and it's impermanent. So this notion that to live is to suffer, again consistent with Hinduism, that we're constantly dissatisfied. The Buddha realized this when he was Siddhartha Gautama, when he was the luxurious, privileged prince. Even in this extreme state of luxury, where he had everything he would ever want, he found he was still dissatisfied. He was still yearning for something more. Or at the very best, even if you weren't, if some of us looked at that video and were like, hey, I could do that. I could sit back and get everything I've ever wanted, never have to worry about a thing, have everything sheltered from me, sounds great. The Buddha's problem with this is that at the very best, even in this state, where one doesn't seem to be suffering, the only way that's able to be achieved is that it ignores mass suffering. So that person must be ignorant to all of the suffering that is happening in the world to everyone. And perhaps that one's own kind of state of what is diluted joy and happiness is the result of other people's suffering. So I have all that I want because others don't have all that they want, all that they could ever want. So he sees this very interconnected state of suffering pervading all aspects of human life. So again, and this is in line with the last slide on anicca, he says, we have our attachments, we all do, and we're going to lose these attachments. These attachments will be broken, they'll be taken from us. So, because of this very basic fact, suffering is inevitable. No one can escape it so long as they have these attachments. We will continuously experience loss and pain. That's what it means to live, is to experience loss and pain. So, we do tend to cling to what we, quote-unquote, have. Or to put it differently, we cling to the experiences that make us feel like we have these things. And then we also yearn for more. We yearn for future desires. We're constantly trying to keep up with the Joneses, to acquire as much as what our neighbors have, because we always think that we don't have enough. We're not content with our current situation. His point is that dukkha pervades all experiences. That the moments of joy that we do have, and I said this in the last slide, are fleeting. We have extreme difficulty sustaining contentment. We can't seem to just settle in our happiness. So we're presented with two options, really. Do we grasp even harder to our attachments, so when we lose them, they're that much more devastating? Or do we release ourselves from our desire? If desire is the problem, can we release ourselves from our desire and our attachments, and in doing so, release ourselves from suffering? This takes the realization that the cause of our suffering is desire, that this constant desire that is inherent within us, that this causes our suffering. This brings us to the third mark of existence, and perhaps the most difficult to wrap our head around. So I'll try to explain it clearly here. If you have questions and need more of an explanation, just tell me, and I'll continue to touch upon this point. So the third one is anatta. And anatta is also sometimes presented as anatman. Notice this root here, atman. It means, atman in the Hindu sense means the self. The Buddhist interpretation is no self, anatman, or non-self, or at the very least, no independent self from all others. So, as a recap, the Hindu concept of atman means the self, right? So, the notion is to strip all of these illusory desires, all of these illusory attachments, so that we get down to what is our core self, which is atman. And this core self, once it experiences moksha, once it divests itself, the human divests itself of all of these attachments and desires, the self, we don't discover that there's no self. What we discover is that this pure self, this Atman, becomes one with Brahman, and that we're part of this larger sense of reality, of ultimate reality. So there's never a denial of the self in Hinduism, just that the pure self is masked with all of these illusory attachments, which make up our identity. So we strip away our identity, and this Atman is that kind of immortal, reincarnating essence to who we are at our core. So in the Buddhist sense, we talk about anatta or anatman, there being no self. We strip away everything, and what's left is nothingness. Not a pure self, but nothingness. The Buddha says that the illusory self, that is made up of all of these, attachments and desires and so on and so forth, is really made up of what he calls the 5 skandhas, or the 5 components. The first, material form, this would be the physical world, including our bodies, the trees, the earth, the substance around us. The second skandha that makes up our illusory self is this notion of feeling and sensation. This would be the physical and the emotional sensations we have. So we are able to sense touch. We're able to sense smell. We're able to sense through sight and through taste. That we have this way to kind of interact with the world around us. That forms the third skandha, which is perception. So from these senses, we create cognition. We're able to perceive objects as a tree or another person. So not only can we touch and feel, but we create a perception, or there is a perception of these things as items, which leads to the fourth skandha, which is mental formations. This is where we actually begin to form thoughts, form opinions, and form habits. This is triggered by our perception. When we perceive something, we begin to react in particular ways. This happens at the down through the insect level, all the way up through the human level. So we react. We start to create mental formations in the ways in which we react to the perceptions and sensations of this material form. The fifth and final one, and this is really the most important, this is what makes us human, would be this level of the skandha, this component of the illusory self, which is our consciousness. So we put all of these things together, the material form, the feeling and sensation, which turns to perception, which allows us to make certain mental formations. And what do we have is this complex network, which is known as consciousness. And this consciousness is what makes us human. Certain animals, I shouldn't make that statement too boldly. I think the Buddha would also realize and recognize plenty of other sentient beings in a non-human form, but to kind of keep it simple and to wrap our head around what these five skandhas are, this is what creates our sense of identity. This is what creates our sense of being my own person. I'm Jeff, and I have these memories, and I have these this sense of consciousness that makes me who I am. The Buddha is saying this is all illusory. This is all we're just fooling ourselves. We're walking into an illusory world thinking that this is what reality actually is. So the goal is that we ought to be able to relinquish all of our attachments to these skandhas. And once we do this, we give way to nirvana. We're able to realize, finally, that there is no self, that this is all illusory, this is all a product of desire and attachments, and that once we strip all this away, what's left is a sense of emptiness, of nothing, of anatman, of no self, of no independent self or non-self. And so this is the same up top. The skandhas, this is how most of us experience our being. This is how we experience existence. This is how we experience reality, is through these skandhas, through these five components of what makes up the illusory self. But he's saying this is the self that we cling to with our desires, and that we must discontinue this. The Buddha says at the very core of us, we have no self, we have nothingness. And the idea here, many of us will maybe be scared of this, or worried about this, or see this as a bad thing. The Buddha would say, no, this isn't a bad thing. This isn't good, or is it bad. This is just what it is. This is the nature of reality itself. So many will say when we get down to the core, there's nothingness. Some will attempt to explain that as this space of nothingness is when you find your Buddha self. So it is explained differently depending on each tradition, but for our purposes here, I think this is a sufficient way to describe it. And then finally, to relieve suffering, which is the thing we're concerned with, right? That very first slide that we talked about the parable of the wounded man who has the poisoned arrow in him. And the Buddha says, don't worry about where it came from, or who shot it, or why, or what's going to happen afterward. Pull the damn arrow out, right? Relieve yourself of your suffering. Get to the root cause of what is causing you pain, what is causing you suffering. The Buddha is saying, extinguish this illusory self, and you'll extinguish suffering. You'll relieve yourself of your suffering. So, how he goes about explaining how to do that, which is that there are four noble truths, and through these four noble truths we'll understand the nature of suffering, and we'll be given instruction as to how to relieve our suffering. And how we do that is to follow the Eightfold Path. That is one way in which we can do it, I should say. It's not the only way.